For 30 years, Sal Moretti's Junkyard sat behind a rusted chain-link fence on the edge of Detroit, and nobody in the neighborhood knew the old man was sitting on a fortune that 3 different people were willing to kill for. When he died alone in his trailer office, he left everything to a mechanic who'd fixed his truck exactly twice. What that mechanic found buried under a crushed 1968 Mustang would drag him into a 40-year-old secret the mob thought was buried forever. The snow was coming down sideways when Marcus Webb got the call that would change his life, and at first he thought it was a scam. He was sitting in his truck outside the unemployment office on Grayshot Avenue, engine running because the heater was the only thing standing between him and frostbite, when a lawyer named Diane Kessler introduced herself and told him that Salvatore Moretti, Sal, from 3 doors down, the cranky old man who ran the salvage yard, had died 2 weeks ago and named him sole heir to his entire estate. "That doesn't make sense," Marcus said. "I barely knew the guy. I jump-started his truck a couple times. Shoveled his walk once during that bad winter." "He was very specific," Kessler said. "You're the only name on the will." Marcus was 34 years old, 4 months behind on rent, and 11 days from losing the lease on his 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the east side. He'd been laid off from the transmission plant 14 months earlier when the line moved to Mexico, and since then he'd been stringing together odd jobs, fixing cars in the laundromat parking lot for cash, doing brake jobs for neighbors who couldn't afford a real shop. His ex-wife had taken the good years with her when she left, and what remained was a stack of medical bills from his mother's stroke, a truck with 210,000 miles on it, and a phone that rang mostly with numbers he didn't recognize and collectors he did. He drove straight to the address Kessler gave him, a modest law office on Jefferson Avenue, half expecting to be told there had been some mistake. Instead, he sat across a desk from a woman who slid a thick folder toward him and told him that he now owned Moretti's Auto Salvage, 4 acres of scrap cars, a falling-down office trailer, and, according to the deed, the land underneath all of it. "There's no cash in the estate," Kessler said, almost apologetically. "Sal didn't have a bank account that we could find. No life insurance. Just the property, the inventory, and some back taxes owed on it. Honestly, Mr. Webb, you might be inheriting a liability more than an asset." Marcus's older brother, Derek, laughed when he heard the news over the phone that night. Derek had a good job at a dealership in the suburbs and never let Marcus forget it. "A junkyard," Derek said. "That's rich. Old man Sal finally does something generous, and it's 4 acres of garbage and a pile of debt. Sounds about right for your luck." Marcus didn't laugh. He drove out to the yard the next morning instead, unlocked the padlock on the gate with the key Kessler had given him, and walked in among the rows of dead cars for the first time as their owner. Snow dusted the hoods of 40-year-old sedans and rusted pickup trucks stacked too high. The office trailer smelled like cigarette smoke and motor oil and looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. Sal's coffee mug still sat on the desk, a ring of dried coffee crusted at the bottom. There was something strange about the place that Marcus couldn't name at first, and it took him 3 days of walking property to figure out what it was. Sal Moretti had barely made any money running this yard. The customer logbook showed maybe 2 or 3 sales a month, mostly scrap metal pickups. And yet he'd paid the property taxes on time, every year, for 30 years, on a piece of land that had to be worth close to $200,000 in back-of-envelope value. A man running a junkyard that quiet shouldn't have been able to afford that. Something didn't add up, and old habits from a childhood spent watching his own father chase get-rich schemes made Marcus suspicious before he had any reason to be. He started clearing out the trailer first, mostly to see if there was anything worth selling. In a locked filing cabinet drawer, locked, in an office where nothing else in the place had a lock on it, he found a manila folder full of newspaper clippings, all of them decades old, all of them about the same subject. A 1987 armored car robbery on the west side that had netted the thieves nearly $4 million, most of which was never recovered. Sal had underlined names in the articles. One name appeared circled in red ink on nearly every clipping. Anthony Tony Rails Ferraro, a mid-level enforcer for a Detroit crime family that had mostly dissolved by the 2000s, its remaining members scattered or dead or in witness protection. Marcus sat with a folder in his lap for a long time before he understood what he was looking at. Sal Moretti hadn't just been a junkyard owner. He'd been watching this case for 30 years. It was the following week, while he was cataloging the vehicle for a scrap appraisal, that Marcus found the trapdoor. He'd been working his way through the back row, the oldest cars, the ones half swallowed by weeds and rust, when he came to a crushed 1968 Ford Mustang fastback sitting on a section of concrete that seemed oddly level for a junkyard. Most of the lot was gravel and date, but this one car sat on a pawed slab about 12 feet square, hidden under decades of grime. He only noticed it because his boot caught on a metal ring bolted flush into the concrete near the Mustang's rear bumper, half buried under packed dirt and old leaves. It took him 2 hours with a chain and his tow truck's winch to drag the crushed Mustang off the slab, and when he finally exposed a full concrete pad, he found a steel hatch set into it, maybe 3 feet across, sealed with a heavy padlock that looked newer than everything else on the property. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold, when he cut the padlock off with a bolt cutter he kept in his truck bed. The hatch groaned open on hinges that hadn't been oiled in years, revealing a steel ladder descending into darkness and the smell of cold, stale air. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his truck and climbed down into what turned out to be a bunker roughly the size of a 2-car garage, poured concrete on all sides, clearly built decades earlier and reinforced far beyond anything a junkyard would ever need. Along one wall stood steel shelving holding cardboard boxes gone soft with humidity. Along another sat a heavy steel safe, the old-fashioned kind with a combination dial, bolted directly into the concrete floor. But it was the boxes that stopped him cold. Inside the first one he opened were bundles of cash, wrapped in brittle rubber bands that snapped when he touched them, the bills so old they had a musty, papery smell that filled the whole bunker. He counted one bundle, $100 bills, $10,000, before he stopped shaking long enough to look at the other boxes. There were 11 of them. Marcus sat down hard on the bottom rung of the ladder and did the math in his head 3 times before he believed it. If every box held roughly what the first one did, he was looking at over $1 million in cash sitting under a dead man's junkyard, cash that had clearly been hidden there for a very long time. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment with a folder of newspaper clippings spread across his kitchen table, reading every article twice, trying to understand what he'd stumbled into. The 1987 armored car robbery had been one of the largest unsolved heists in Detroit history. 3 masked men had hit a Brinks truck outside a suburban bank, made off with nearly $4 million, and vanished. 2 suspects were eventually arrested years later on unrelated charges and quietly convicted, but the money itself was never recovered, and the third man involved, believed to be the inside coordinator, was never identified. The case had gone cold sometime in the mid-90s and stayed that way. Marcus searched Sal Moetti's name online and found almost nothing. No criminal record, no arrests, nothing beyond a handful of property records and an old obituary for a wife who died in 1994. Whatever Sal's connection to the robbery had been, he'd kept himself scrubbed clean of it for 30 years, sitting quietly on his junkyard, watching, waiting, for reasons Marcus couldn't yet guess. The next morning, Marcus drove to the yard planning to go back down into the bunker and open the safe, but he never made it past the gate. A black Cadillac Escalade was parked outside, engine running, exhaust curling into the cold morning air. A man stepped out as Marcus pulled up, mid-50s, heavy-set, wearing a wool coat that looked expensive against the run-down street, with a kind of stillness in his posture that Marcus's gut recognized as dangerous before his mind caught up. "Mr. Webb," the man said, extending a hand Marcus didn't take. "My name is Anthony Ferraro. I believe you knew my father." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tony Rails, the man circled in red ink on every one of Sal's newspaper clippings. This was his son. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, which was mostly true. Ferraro smiled without warmth. "My father passed 6 months ago. Prison does that to a man eventually, even one as tough as he was. Before he died, he told me a story about an old friend who used to run a junkyard, a man who'd agreed to hold something safe for family a long time ago, back when things got hot after a job went sideways. My father always said the old man got greedy, said he was going to keep it, said if anyone came looking he'd tell the police everything he knew. So the family left him alone for 30 years. Didn't want to give the police any reason to start digging again." He looked past Marcus toward the rows of scrap cars. "But now the old man's dead, and there's a new owner, and I find myself wondering whether you know what you're sitting on, Mr. Webb, and whether you're smarter than to make the same mistake he almost made. Marcus's mouth went dry. There's nothing here but scrap metal. Then you won't mind if my associates take a look around sometime, Ferraro said, still smiling. Consider this a courtesy visit. My father kept his word to leave the old man in peace because digging it up wasn't worth the exposure while he was inside. I don't have his patience, and I don't have 30 years left to wait politely. He got back into the Escalade. Think about your options, Mr. Webb. I'll be in touch. Marcus stood in the cold lawn after the SUV pulled away, his heart hammering. He'd owned this junkyard for exactly 9 days, and it had already made him a target. He went straight back to the bunker that afternoon, this time bringing a crowbar and every bit of nerve he had left, determined to get into the safe before Ferraro's people came back. It took him 3 hours of trial and error, working through numbers from the newspaper clippings, dates of the robbery, badge numbers of the officers on the case, anything Sal might have used, before he thought to try the one number that hadn't occurred to him, his own late father's badge number from decades on the Detroit police force, a number Marcus knew by heart because his father used to make him memorize it as a kid, like a party trick. It was a wild guess, based on nothing but a hunch that Sal's decision to leave everything to Marcus specifically, a man he barely knew, had to be connected to something more than a shoveled sidewalk. The dial clicked home. The safe door swung open. Inside, instead of more cash, Marcus found a single leather-bound notebook and a stack of photographs. The notebook was filled with Sal Moretti's careful, cramped handwriting, dated entries going back to 1988, and as Marcus read through it with trembling hands, the whole story unfolded. Sal hadn't been a junkyard owner who stumbled into hiding mob money. Sal had been an undercover informant for the Detroit Police Department, planted inside the Ferraro crew years before the robbery, tasked with gathering evidence on the family's operations. When the armored car job happened, Sal was ordered by his handler, Marcus's own father. It turned out, a detective named Walter Webb who had died of a heart attack when Marcus was 19, to accept his cut of the stolen money and hide it exactly where the family expected, so that when the case eventually came together, the money and the evidence trail would both be sitting in one place, waiting. But the case never came together. Sal's handler died of a heart attack 18 months later. The file went cold, and Sal, terrified of exposing himself without police protection, and increasingly certain that revealing what he knew would get him killed regardless of what promises had been made, simply stayed quiet and stayed put, running his junkyard, keeping watch over the money and the evidence for 30 years, waiting for someone he could trust to hand it to. The notebook's final entry, dated just 2 months before Sal died, answered the last question. Asterisk Walter's boy grew up decent. Watched him shovel my walk without being asked. He'll do right with this when the time comes. And it's time. I'm tired, and I'm not getting any younger, and Tony Rails is dying in prison, and his boy is worse than he ever was. Left it all to Marcus. God forgive me for putting this on him, but there's no one else left who'd know what to do with it. Asterisk. Marcus sat in that concrete bunker for a long time, the notebook open on his knees, understanding for the first time that Sal Moretti hadn't left him a junkyard by accident, and that his own father had been part of this story from the very beginning. The photographs in the safe were evidence, surveillance shots of Tony Rail Ferraro meeting with 2 other men Marcus didn't recognize outside a bank 2 days before the 1987 robbery, time-stamped, exactly the kind of evidence that could still tie the current Ferraro family to decades of buried crimes, evidence that could reopen a case everyone assumed was permanently dead. He barely made it out of the bunker and back to his truck before his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A single photo, his own apartment building, taken from across the street, with a red circle drawn crudely around his window. No caption. He didn't need one. Marcus didn't go home that night. He drove to a motel of I-94, checked in under a fake name with cash from his own wallet, and sat on the edge of the bed with a notebook and the photograph spread in front of him, trying to think through his options with a clarity that fear kept threatening to shatter. He could give it all to Ferraro and hope that was the end of it, but he didn't believe for 1 second that a man like that would leave a living witness behind once he had what he wanted. He could run, disappear somewhere far from Detroit, but that meant abandoning everything, including whatever thin promise of justice Sal Moretti had spent 30 years protecting. Or he could do what his own father should have been able to do decades earlier, if he'd lived long enough. Take the evidence somewhere it couldn't be buried again. He called the only person he could think of who might still be around from that old case, a retired detective named Ruth Alvarez, whose name appeared throughout Sal's notebook as Walter Webb's partner on the original task force. He found her number through an old department directory a friend still on the force helped him track down, and when he called, she was skeptical for exactly 30 seconds, right up until he read her the badge number that had opened the safe. There was a long silence on the line. "Walter's kid," she finally said. "I always wondered what happened to Sal Moretti. Get somewhere safe. Don't go back to that yard alone. I'll make some calls." He didn't sleep in that first motel room either. He kept the lamp on and the notebook within reach, rereading Sal's cramped handwriting until the words blurred, trying to memorize the details in case the physical pages were ever taken from him. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he found himself thinking not about the money, which had already started to feel like the least important part of everything he'd uncovered, but about his father, a man he remembered mostly as tired, quiet, gone too early, a detective who'd never once mentioned an informant named Sal or a case that aided him for the last years of his life. Marcus realized he'd spent 15 years thinking of his father as simply absent, worn down by an unremarkable job, when the truth was his father had been carrying a secret heavy enough to require 30 more years and a stranger's death to finally come loose. It was a strange kind of grief, mourning a man twice for 2 different reasons 15 years apart. The next 2 days were the longest of Marcus's life. He moved between 2 more motels, paying cash, keeping his phone off except to check in with Alvarez, who was working quietly to get the current cold case unit to take the file seriously without tipping off anyone connected to Ferraro. On the 3rd night, as Marcus sat in a diner parking lot, deciding whether to trust that any of this was actually going to work, the black Escalade pulled in 2 spots down from his truck. Ferraro got out alone this time, no bodyguards, which somehow made him more frightening rather than less. He walked up to Marcus's window and knocked twice, polite as ever. "You've been hard to find, Mr. Webb," he said when Marcus rolled the window down an inch. "I'm going to assume that means you found something down there worth being careful about." "I don't have anything you want," Marcus said, his hand inching toward the gearshift. "I think you do," Ferraro said. "And I think you should understand something before you make any more decisions about it. My father spent 18 years in prison protecting the location of that money and never said a word, because he understood something you clearly don't. Evidence like that doesn't just disappear because you hand it to the police. It disappears because the person holding it disappears." His voice stayed calm, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. "Give me the notebook and the photographs tonight, and we can all go back to pretending this never happened. Don't, and I promise you, Mr. Webb, that Junkyard becomes the last thing you ever inherit." Marcus's hands were steady on the wheel now, steadier than they'd been in days, because somewhere in the last 72 hours of fear had curdled into something harder. "Funny thing about evidence," he said, "it's already gone. Copies. Emailed to a detective this afternoon, and a couple other places, in case something happens to me. You kill me tonight. It doesn't disappear. It gets worse for you." It was a bluff. Alvarez had told him not to send anything digitally yet, worried about leaving a trail that could compromise the case before it was built properly, but Ferraro's face flickered, just slightly, just long enough for Marcus to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. That flicker of hesitation was the only opening Marcus needed. He threw the truck into reverse as Ferraro stepped back, tires screeching against wet pavement, and peeled out of the lot with his heart slamming against his ribs, watching in the mirror as Ferraro stood frozen for a moment before sprinting back toward his own vehicle. Marcus didn't head for another motel. He drove straight to the address Alvarez had given him that afternoon, a federal building downtown, lights still on in a 3rd-floor office where she'd promised 2 agents from an organized crime task force would be waiting. He made it with the Escalade's headlights still visible 3 cars back in his mirror the entire way. What happened over the following weeks unfolded slower than Marcus expected, the way real justice usually does. Nothing as clean or immediate as the moment he handed the notebook and photographs across a conference table to 2 federal agents and Ruth Alvarez, who looked at the evidence with the expression of someone finally closing a door she'd left open for 30 years. Anthony Ferraro was arrested 11 days later, not for the decades-old robbery itself, which was too old to prosecute directly, but for witness intimidation and racketeering charges built on wiretaps that came together once investigators finally knew where to look. The recovered cash, once authenticated, the proceeds from the 1987 robbery, went into a lengthy legal limbo of asset forfeiture proceedings. Marcus never expected to keep a dollar of it, and he was right not to, though a portion was eventually released to him as a finder's corporation payment after the case concluded, enough to clear his debts and then some, though nowhere near the fortune the boxers had first suggested. But the junkyard itself, the land, the deed, all of that was his outright, and 6 months later Marcus stood in the same lot where he'd once found a trapdoor under a crushed Mustang, watching a crew from the city help him clear out decades of scrap to make room for what he decided to build instead, a real repair shop, the kind he'd always wanted to run, named, after some hesitation, and then not much at all, Moetti and Webb's Garage. A small plaque by the door explaining nothing of what had happened underneath the concrete slab where the office now stood. He kept Sal's old coffee mug on his own desk. Some inheritances aren't about the money at all. They're about finishing something someone else started and never got the chance to see through. If this story had you holding your breath, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you'd have done in Marcus's shoes. Share this with someone who loves a story where the past refuses to stay buried, and subscribe so you never miss the next one, because some of the best inheritances aren't cash or property. Sometimes they're a debt someone else left unpaid, waiting for the right person to finally settle it.